Hello, everyone. I'm Fran Hagopian. I teach in the government department, and I'm a co-moderator of our Tuesday webinar series this semester. And I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to our panel on Latin America's energy transition, wind and solar power in Brazil. Before I do one more thing, I want to thank our spectacular Dr. Class staff, who as always take care of everything for us behind the scenes, Gabby, Jillian, and Paula. And I want to also introduce my co-moderators. Alicia, do you want to say hello? Alicia Holland, my junior colleague.
Hi, everyone.
And my jefe, or jefe, depending on where you are positioned, the director of Dr. Class, Steve Levitsky.
I prefer comandante. Hi, everyone.
So our panel today is about Latin America's energy transition, and we timed this to coincide with what happened in Texas last week. We thought that it would be important to alert all of you to what happens when you start an energy transition. At least this is, as I understand it, the aspiration for an energy transition is what caused the massive power outages across Texas. But to get back to our story, we've been quite vigilant this year about trying to address big, major, important questions facing Latin America at this time, and in our Latin America's energy transition and environment are certainly part of those challenges. And to address these issues today, have we got an all-star panel for you? We have our headliner is our friend Kathy Hochstetler, who is joining us from London today, from LSE. And Kathy is someone who is one of the unquestioned leaders in studying not just environmental politics in Latin America, but social movements. And her work, all of her work, has been path-breaking. I assign it all in my course on Brazilian politics. She has a couple of major books about the environment in Latin America, in Brazil. One called Greening Brazil was co-authored with my friend Mimi Keck. This came out from Duke in 2007. It was about environmental activism in state and society. And it, of course, won all kinds of prizes. But her most recent book is what we're going to hear about today: Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa, coming out from Cambridge this year. So you're getting a great preview. And to comment on Kathy's upcoming work, we've lined up two spectacular discussants. Alicia Cooperman is one of the young generation, well-trained, brilliant, who will be leading us forward in the coming decades. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University. She researches local and global challenges in the political economy of development. She's looked at water and energy policy. She has looked at civil society and accountability, as well as environmental politics. She's used field experiments and original household surveys. She's done field work in Ceará. And she comes with training from Columbia, a postdoc at Princeton, and an undergraduate degree from Stanford and degrees from UCSD. So anyway, we're really looking forward to hearing from Alicia. And our second discussant is an old friend and colleague from Brazil, the dean, I would say, of work on environmental politics in Brazil. And that is Eduardo Viola. Eduardo is a full professor he's been a full professor at the Institute of International Relations in Brasilia. He's been a senior researcher of the Brazilian Council of Scientific and Technological Development, the CNPq, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at USP at the University of São Paulo. He is the coordinator of the research group, the International System in the Anthropocene. He's got all kinds of international visiting appointments. He's been at Stanford, Boulder, UT Austin. He's been in Amsterdam, and he's been in my old stomping ground, the University of Notre Dame. He's international. He's an internationally known expert, members of scientific committees. He's written dozens of book chapters. His last book, co-authored with Matias Franchini, is Brazil and Climate Change Beyond the Amazon. That was published by Routledge a few years ago. So the last couple of notes that I want to make before I hand this panel over to Kathy is that we are being recorded today. And a full recording will be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel following the event. We have disabled the chat for attendees. Sorry about that, but we do want to hear from you. And so I and my co-moderators will be actively monitoring the question and answer function in your Zoom screens. So please feel free to introduce yourself and drop in questions in the question and answer function. And after the speakers finish speaking, we will try to get in as many rounds of questions as we can. Let me apologize in advance. We won't probably be able to get to every question, but we will do our best. So let me, without further ado, hand this over to Kathy. Kathy, we're really excited to hear about the book. So take it away.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Fran. And this really is a treat to be able to come and talk with you virtually about the book, and to hear then Alicia and Eduardo's comments on this. Eduardo and I go back to the very beginning of my first research in Brazil in 1989, when I met him in Florianopolis. So we have a very, very long standing relationship. And I think I met Alicia maybe at a similar stage in her own work. So kind of positioned between the two of them, and very pleased to be here today, even if it is via the hated Zoom and we can't all go off and have lunch together afterwards. But otherwise, I probably wouldn't be able to come over from London just for this. So I always feel like I should explain to people, I don't know who needs to hear this, but the origin of this project is actually in failure. In that, way back in 2009, I wrote a grant proposal because I was very excited about state-driven infrastructure projects in Brazil and South Africa and the energy sector. I thought there was really something there to study that would be very interesting. It did not get funded. And so the next year, I wrote a new grant proposal that was about emerging powers in the climate negotiations, also Brazil and South Africa. And then it had a study in it about state-driven energy infrastructure projects. So I snuck my project into the one on climate change, and it got funded. And I actually think that this failure is really integral to how the book ended up turning out. And it is very much now a book that tries to take an audience who's interested in climate change and teach it things about development, and to take an audience that's interested in development and teach it things about climate change. So that kind of moving back and forth between the two is in many ways a product of this failed grant. And I think the project is actually stronger for it. And then as I did extensive field work on climate and energy politics, I realized that there really was plenty of material on just wind and solar power for a standalone book. And so went on then to write this book about political economies of energy transition. And when you look at wind and solar power in a standard way, one of the major approaches comes from the literature on climate change, where science tells us that transitioning to wind and solar power is a really straightforward way of addressing climate change. There's also a literature on socio-technical transition that looks at wind and solar power as important new industries, sources of creative innovation in societies. And if you looked at these standard literatures, they would lead you to expect lots of wind and solar power, because they really just give us reasons for promoting wind and solar power. But if you look at the outcomes in Brazil and South Africa, you see that there's nothing quite so straightforward going on. This is a chart from the first chapter of the book, and you see that Brazilian wind power, that's the top line, grows gangbusters, and it's 10% of the built infrastructure at this point. So it's really expands. But the kind of wind power, or the kind of electricity that does worst out of these four, is solar power in Brazil. and it comes along only much later and at much lower levels. And in South Africa, in contrast, you have what was a very strong start for both wind and solar power, and then both of them start to go backwards and stalemate together. And so clearly, we get a starting story in these outcomes, which is that this is not a simple story of climate action. It's not a simple story of technical innovation. Instead, I argue, it's a story that needs comparative political economy, that we can't really understand what's going on here without bringing in some of our tools from comparative political economy and Latin American studies. And probably the biggest argument of the book is that if we want to understand energy transitions, we need to understand that they're a political economy transition, much like the transition from state ownership to market, and that in fact, we can use a lot of the same approaches, theories, and tools that we use to study that those other kinds of political economy transitions to also study the energy transition. And so, as you can see in my parentheses here, for that reason, I think energy transition should be much more interesting to scholars of Latin American studies than it has been so far. I think that it should be as interesting to us as the earlier market transitions were, and I would argue it's going to be as transformative of Latin American politics and economics in the years going forward, especially with the influence of growing climate change. So what does it mean that we can use the same approaches and tools? Well, I think like the earlier market transition, we do have a basic structure of political and economic interests that are at the core of energy transition. But as we know, interests do not operate on their own. They operate in the context of existing institutions. They operate in the context of existing power relations. And so what I see in my comparative political economy approach to wind and solar power is I see a series of state society coalitions that are built out of interests, institutions, and power. And I draw on different theoretical literatures out of comparative political economy to talk about those multiple state society coalitions. And I argue that there are actually 4 political economies all going on at once. And so borrowing this language from Peter Kingstone's book on economic transition in Brazil, crafting coalitions for reform, I argue that there are actually 4 simultaneous procedures going on where state and social actors are crafting coalitions that either promote wind and solar power or work against them. And each of them has a somewhat different interest structure. That's what I'm identifying here on this page. The interest structure related to climate change is very different from the infrastructure related to consumption of electricity. So they have these very different dynamics. They also are involving different state institutions. So ministries of environment, very involved in climate change, involved again in the 4th political economy. They do environmental impact assessment of project placement, but ministries of environment really don't do much with industrial policy. That's a Ministry of Economy or Ministry of Trade and Industry in the Brazilian case. And then it's a completely different set of institutions that works with distribution and consumption issues, public utilities. And partly because of, and then the societal actors are also different. Sometimes it's consumers, sometimes it's local communities, sometimes it's firms, sometimes it's climate activists. And so my argument really is that there's this complexity of state and societal actors that are all engaged in helping to make arguments and build coalitions for and against energy transition at the same time. And the basic methodology of the book is to look at each of these political economies one by one. So there's a chapter on climate change that looks at the dynamics of the climate issue in Brazil and the dynamics in South Africa, a chapter on industrial policy that looks at the dynamics of industrial policy. And the methodology is to say, once I examine those dynamics, do they help to account for those differential outcomes for wind and solar power that I showed you on the last slide? So the kind of matching of dynamics and outcomes as a methodology. And of course, the other major argument that I make in the book is that after one looks at each of these political economies and one examines them through these different theoretical literatures, whether it be the state capacity literature for climate change or industrial policy for industrial policy, then there's a final stage of asking, how do they fit together? Because you can imagine a situation where a country has a policy that's in favor of climate action, but over in the industrial policy arena, they might be promoting fossil fuels. And so there's this question then of whether how do these political economies interlock? Do they reinforce each other? Do they counteract each other? What is the intersection of them as a final story about wind and solar power in these emerging powers of Brazil and South Africa? And I have three big takeaways because I was only given 20 minutes. So I now need to move on to my three big takeaways. But believe me, the book has massive amounts of detailed fieldwork-based research on exactly what each of these policy arenas or political economies looks like. But I have really three big takeaways from the story for those of you who might then want to go and read the book for the detail. The first takeaway is that despite what I've said, climate change does matter. And so the basic question of climate change is the state capacity question. Do states have the capacity to identify long-term national interests, like addressing a problem like climate change, and to work towards those even over the interests of powerful actors? So it's a kind of classic bringing the state back in conception of state capacity here. And my argument is that this climate change political economy is really the heart of the comparison between the two cases. Because when you go to look at South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions, which climate change tells us to look at, well, that top line in South Africa is the energy sector. And half of that is the electricity sector. And so about half of South Africa's emissions are in the electricity sector, and they are being produced by a giant state-owned corporation, Eskom, which builds coal and a bit of nuclear and only really knows how to do that. So South Africa presents a really dramatic version of this state capacity strategy, which is that the South African government, if it wants to work on climate change, needs to take on this incredibly powerful coal-related actor. And I won't talk about the South African case today because I know you're Latin American studies people, but it's a very, very interesting case, and it has sort of all the storm and drama and controversy and difficulty. It's not really a surprise that South Africa ends up in stalemate because there are such powerful actors on both sides of the question about energy transition. Brazil sits there on the other side, and I'll go on to the next slide. But so Brazil, it has also a dominant sector for emissions, but the dominant sector for emissions in Brazil is deforestation and land use. So climate politics is very difficult in Brazil. We know Bolsonaro is not committed to climate action at all. There's a lot of drama around the climate debate. But the role of electricity is much, much smaller in Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions. It's under 5% of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions. And so questions about energy transition have much less they're much less relevant for Brazilian greenhouse gas emissions. And so what that has produced is what you see on the right, which is that there's been a remarkable political consensus on wind and solar power. The policies start with Cardoso. Lula picks them up very smoothly in the next year. They go on to Dilma Rousseff. And even after she's impeached, they're one of the policies that Michel Temer continues. And then Bolsonaro himself, who does not have any pro-environment inclinations in his body, is fine with wind and solar power. They're not producing a lot of it because of the the economic crisis, but his team is generally in favor of wind and solar power. And so it's this remarkable political consensus in the Brazilian context that I argue comes from this different political economy of climate change. And as a result, gives us this model in Brazil where the decisions made on wind and solar power are largely made by bureaucrats, following standard operating procedure in their bureaucracies, whether that be in BNDES or the energy regulator ANEEL, or the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética that does the energy planning. It really is much more of a bureaucratic process than what we saw in South Africa. And so that's the first lesson, that the difference on climate change and the different modes of the different starting points on which sectors create their climate change problems just gives us a really different starting point for the two cases, that in the Brazilian case demobilizes, depoliticizes wind and solar power, whereas the conflict level is pushed up in the South African case. And so then, and it doesn't really account, the climate change political economy does not tell us produce lots of wind power and no solar power. The climate change motivation would tell us produce lots of both kinds of wind and solar power. It wouldn't say put off solar power for 15 years in a sunny tropical country. So that's another sign that climate change is not really driving the outcomes in Brazil, but that it's other factors. So it is. And here we get to a slide then that highlights the main things that I think do affect the differential Brazilian outcome. So the chart on the right is the planning documents, or the results of the planning documents for wind, that's on the left, and then solar power, that's on the right. And the basic story of these graphs is that first, wind becomes cheap enough that Brazilian electricity planners decide every year that the next 10 years, they will produce more wind than they were planning to last year. And so as you can see, it's kind of a steady upward curve. Every year starts with the actual production levels. And then solar power, once it becomes cheap enough in 2013 and 2014, begins a similar kind of rise. But the cost differential from the chapter on distribution and consumption is really important. But then the chapter that I think is in many ways the more interesting one, and that really tells us a lot about the Brazilian political economy of wind and solar power, is actually the chapter on industrial policy, because there's fascinating stuff going on in that chapter. Brazil's policies that come from the Ministry of Energy do not include any industrial policy in them. It has auctions where companies bid to be the low price bidders to build electricity. But here's the catch. You can only win these auctions if you have finance from BNDES. And BNDES has a 60% local content requirement. And that 60% local content requirement is much easier in wind power for Brazil than 60% local content in solar power. And Brazil has already been building airplanes. A lot of the industrial skills that are involved in building airplanes translate into building wind turbines. And so there's a fairly straightforward set of reasons. Once BNDES bureaucratically applies its requirements for finance, you start to have local production of wind power, and it creates what they call a green spiral, where the emerging manufacturing sector becomes a lobby for more wind power. Then it's a bigger sector, and then it demands more wind power. It's a kind of positive spiral between the economic actors who have a concrete interest in having more wind power and the bureaucrats who are doing the planning. And so the other thing to note is that there's an issue of timing also. So the wind power comes earlier because it's cheaper, and then by historical accident, I guess I will say, that means it came during the Workers' Party governments, which had more expansive industrial policies for expanded BNDES finance, whereas solar power, which mostly started in 2014, then mostly emerged in a context of economic crisis and the like. So, then you get these very different industrial policy outcomes. Quite a few, 100,000 wind jobs, 25% of which are in manufacturing. So it's quite a successful industrial policy in that way. Many fewer solar jobs, and most of them in installation and not in manufacturing. So these industrial policy outcomes then are a very important part of the political economy of wind and solar power. And I think better than other things help to explain then why they do so differently in that context. So to expand this to a broader lesson then, I also find this is the case in South Africa. So industrial policy and costs are very important outcomes in South Africa as well. And I would argue, or it's a kind of hypothesis at this point, that as we move away from the European countries that were early adopters of wind and solar power and move into the rest of the developing world, that we're likely to find these kinds of economic motivations to be the things that drive wind and solar power outcomes. And then the last point that I would want to make about this is that even though it is a new industry, wind and solar power, in many ways, both Brazil and South Africa approach this industry with their old political economy, the existing institutions, the existing infrastructures, the existing labor skills, the existing power relations really are influential in the ways that the countries take these up. It's probably especially notable in the South African case, where in all of my chapters, apartheid and the legacies of apartheid really structure, in consumption, for example, when the apartheid government leaves in 1994, only white people have electricity. And the 2/3 of Black South Africans don't yet have electricity. So that then really structures the way South Africa does consumption. Who works in the coal industry in South Africa? Black miners. So who are not skilled to do other kinds of jobs. So there's a really clear, in the South African case, influence of this old political economy. And I would say it's quite similar in the Brazilian case, in that the industrial policy used for wind and solar power in Brazil is very much like the industrial policy used for automobiles, very much like the industrial policy used to create the aircraft industry in the first place. There's a set of institutions, BNDES, the Ministry of Industry, that have been very influential in industrial policy in Brazil, with not a lot of difference from one industry to another. So a question that I think might be of interest to your audience in particular, like, what does this mean if we were to go beyond Brazil to the rest of Latin America? And I think when it comes to electricity, we actually probably have a fairly similar kind of story for at least some of the Latin American countries, that the region as a whole is heavily reliant, South America in particular, heavily reliant on hydropower, as Brazil is. And so would have a similar kind of electricity greenhouse gas structure. Hydropower is better for climate change than it is for other environmental issues. So I can talk more about that, obviously, but that's definitely a dynamic going on across the region. And then I did a survey, had my PhD student at the time, Antulio Rosales, do a survey of Mexico and the South American countries. And it turned out that all of them, except for Chile, had policies that were promoting wind and solar power for industrial policy or consumer supply, or both of those, which suggests that the other countries of Latin America have similar ambitions for wind and solar power. I think it's notable that Chile is the only one that actually has large amounts of solar power. And part of the reason is because it's not trying to develop its own industry. But when it comes to energy, I think Brazil has some interesting contrasts or comparisons also in the region, because I've been very strict here talking about electricity, and I'm sure Eduardo's going to point this out, that if we were to expand the lens a little bit and talk about energy rather than electricity, well, what we find is that while the electricity sector is pretty good from a climate perspective in South America, the energy sector is not so good. So not only Brazil, but Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Venezuela, these are countries that are deeply dependent on fossil fuels, oil and gas in their economies. And so if we were to talk about energy as opposed to electricity, then we get a rather different picture of the possibilities of energy transition. And so I do think, there's some critical framing questions for proponents. Is this something, are wind and solar power best called climate policies? Are they best called energy policies? I think my research suggests that one of the most powerful framings of them would be as industrial policy, as it comes close to what many of the countries have as ambitions. And it certainly was a very important part of the Brazilian story. So I can't see my clock, so I don't know if I've gone over my 20 minutes, but I think I have to leave it there, and very happy to hear what the discussants have to say now.
You did great. So I was in awe of how you can summarize a book so effectively in such a short period of time. So no problem at all. Let's turn first to Alicia.
Great. Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation to be with you today, and to Dr. Huck Stetler, to Kathy for her outstanding book, really. I was lucky to see early versions of it at Rapal, and the ideas in this book were very influential during my work as a postdoc on energy transition. So I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer, or at least some context. So in general, I study environmental politics and local politics, but my relationship to the energy transition in Brazil is a bit indirect. So most of my fieldwork and research projects are in Brazil, but focused on water access and drought politics in the Northeast. So I've not explicitly studied renewable energy in Brazil. But the flip side of that is that my postdoc at Princeton with peers and the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment was on a project called Rapid Switch about the socio-political challenges and opportunities inherent in the renewable energy transition in the US, India, and Australia. And the project was in the works of expanding to Brazil while I was there, but I'm not sure where they got with that. So I kind of see this from these two different sides. And then third, I now live in Texas. And you may have heard about the winter storm we had last week, a statement I never thought I would make. I left New York for a reason, which was warm weather. And the fact that many government officials, including our governor, opted to use wind energy as a scapegoat. And this is the extension of recent opposition to renewable energy transition overall and to regulation of energy markets in Texas. And so on that topic, I default to excellent analyses by Jesse Jenkins in an op-ed in the New York Times last week, and Leah Stokes at UC Santa Barbara in her book, Short Circuiting Policy, which actually is a really interesting conversation, that book with Kathy's book. So I was lucky to have power last week because I live very close to the utilities headquarters, but hundreds of thousands of people in the state were not so lucky. And so I wasn't expecting energy transition to hit close to home, but here we are. So all of those experiences bring me to a couple of key points that Kathy's book brought up for me, and that really build off of her last slide in terms of thinking about the role of incumbent fossil fuel interests and outages, as well as kind of long-term outlook of the transition in Brazil if we look at energy as a whole. So the first one is about the role of incumbent special interests and how this might change over time in Brazil. So in South Africa, the story is clear. Coal is king, and that was also the heart of the story during my work on the transition in India, as well as the role of fossil fuel interests here in the US and Texas. And while Brazil certainly leads the way in renewable energy when it comes to electricity generation, that's different, as Kathy raised in her last slide, from overall energy supply. And so one measure that I was looking at from the US Energy Information Administration, where they got their data from the Brazilian counterpart, is that 46% of Brazil's energy supply is from petroleum and oil products, 11% from natural gas, 6% from coal. And it's one of the leading producers of oil and gas in Latin America, which has gone up steadily over time. So Kathy's book points to some key questions about paying the costs and benefits of the transition moving forward. And often the costs are targeted to specific fossil fuel producing areas, which are not the same geographically as the renewable energy producing areas. And so I wonder about Brazil on this front. With the climate action political economy, the narrative focuses on curbing deforestation. And so there hasn't been as much discussion about rolling back greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel based, either power generation or just energy supply overall. And I'm curious why the fossil fuel sector hasn't had as much resistance. Is it because there's really been no push at all to curb their investments from a climate change perspective? And how might this change in the future? The book mentions the fact that Brazil and South Africa, as late adopters, didn't see solar and wind as risky investments, and maybe were already aware of a potential for stranded assets facing fossil fuel producers in other countries. But I'm wondering if there are or might be in the future any initiatives to roll back exploration and production under Petrobras. And will this bureaucratically driven transition that we've seen so far continue to hold when fossil fuel rollbacks eventually need to be part of the discussion? So that's my first main point. The second one is about outages and attribution of the blame of disasters. So this really is coming from my experience this past week. But one of the bigger talking points around opposition to renewables is that they're unreliable. And Jesse Jenkins mentioned in his op-ed that wind power in the energy mix is, quote, reliably unreliable. And what happened in Texas was that the stable fossil fuel sources ended up not being so stable or reliable after all. And so intermittency and outages have also been dominant in discussions of climate change and energy policy in California around wildfires. So something fascinating to me is the role of attribution in shaping public responses to these transitions. So who do people blame for the events themselves and their impacts? In Texas, do they blame wind power? Do they blame deregulation, fossil fuels, climate change? Or is it just a freak storm from Mother Nature that we could not have prepared for? And my hunch is that people's attribution of the causes of these disasters will shape their feelings and ultimately their political behavior. And that attribution is not random, it's shaped by the media and by political narratives, which are often shaped by these special interests that are part of these big political economies. And so I'm wondering about the public response to intermittency in Brazil. I'm recalling delaying a visit to Sao Paulo in 2014 because the drought had caused water and power outages due to the reliance on hydropower. And then what about the outages in Amapá in November? There was speculation, ultimately proven wrong, that lightning and weather was the cause of that. Hydroelectric plants are a big part of their power there. How do opposition groups spin these extremely destructive events in their favor? Has there been a similar backlash in Brazil? Who do people blame for these outages? And how might that narrative, kind of manipulation of the narrative, be used by both proponents and opponents in the future if and when fossil fuels do need to be rolled back? And so lastly, I know I'm probably running out of time. In terms of the long-term outlook here, I'm going to do that really annoying thing and ask how the models in the book might apply in the next 5, 10, 20 years. But when we think about climate change, that's kind of the time frame for a lot of these policies. And so, yeah, something I've mentioned already is whether the push towards mitigation or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions will force rollbacks in fossil fuels in Brazil, and what that discussion has looked like or might look like. And then also how the political economy of climate change relates to adaptation to these extreme weather events. And is the Brazilian grid resilient to extreme heat, storms, droughts that are going to increase with climate change? Regarding industrial policy, I'm curious to hear more about Bolsonaro's removal of the CEO of Petrobras over diesel costs, and how shifts in subsidies might affect the discussion around industrial policy, but also social policy and service provision. So kind of bringing the second and third political economies together when we think about subsidies for oil, gas, diesel. And then lastly, in terms of the siting policy, I'm super curious from my work in the Northeast about the role of solar and wind investments in the Sertão, where I've done most of my research. And solar power generation requires a not insignificant amount of water, which in a drought-prone region is a challenge. So how we balance these different tensions, especially considering communities and community ownership and community mobilization, which is where a lot of my Brazilian research has focused. These are some other areas that I'm very interested in. So to wrap things up, I'm just so grateful to Kathy for her excellent research and analysis. The book is an amazing encyclopedia of the histories of these renewable energy transitions in Brazil and South Africa, and a fantastic framework for studying these dynamics in other countries, but also thinking about how we understand the same ones in the future. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. And now, Eduardo, por favor.
Okay, thank you very much. Kathy, I think one problem is that I haven't read your book, but I know through other articles your framing of the issue, and my feeling is that in this book you really have achieved a major progress in understanding at least the Brazilian dynamic of solar and power. Probably yes, also in the case of South Africa, but my knowledge is almost non-existent about South Africa. So I have, I would like to say that the whole framework of the book looks to me very consistent. This comparative political economy approach with multiple actors, and so how you frame the combination between climate change, industrial policy, distribution and consumption, sitting in particular location, it looks very consistent. So because I need to make some comments, I will raise some doubts, or I will question some issues. The first of all is not related specifically to this solar and power, but is something that we have debated some, and I would like to hear you. What do you think right now? I think Brazil is a declining power, not a rising power, an emerging power. So you use this conceptualization. I don't know if South Africa is not anymore an emerging power, but I would say, I have the conviction, I am persuaded over many years in the last decade that Brazil is a declining power, and is as far a declining power that is following the somehow with delay the way of Argentina of decline. Okay, there is a social forces, and the state are in a kind of they are stuck. There is no, and the only important transformation, that is the powerful development of the agribusiness, has not been sufficient for changing this situation, and I don't see this will change in the near future. This is the first question. The second question is that probably is in the book, but I would like to raise, is that in my view, according to what I have read and my own research, there is no energy transition in Brazil. Okay, Brazil has, compared with the world, a much more low carbon energy matrix, but this started well before the idea of climate change driving energy transition. Okay, so the ethanol development, the biofuel, was completely related to energy security in the 70s, 80s. and the fact that the coal was not relevant in the history of the energy matrix because Brazil didn't have coal and even didn't have oil during a long time, and for that reason it built up as a hydroelectric power. Okay, but if we look at the 21st century, we can see that the energy matrix of Brazil has keep more or less frozen, and in some moments with increased carbonization, and the electricity matrix also. Okay, so the idea is how would you justify that Brazil is in an energy transition? The third question is about your emphasis in that in the case of solar and wind, the transition is bureaucratically driven. But you give a lot of importance to the BNDES, and I agree with that. But the question is that the development of solar and power under Cardoso was in the last year. I mean, it was nothing, in my view, it was not relevant. Okay, it was the beginning, but was not a government committed to it with energy, with wind and solar. The most important development promotion by the state was during the PT governments, that of course put in the BNDES, the top of BNDES, people that were completely linked to the PT, even if you know they don't were members of the PT. So I think you are exaggerating a little bit when you say that it's a bureaucratic transition, because I think the PT, for the reasons you are raising, it is, but because of industrial policy, not because of climate change, is secondary, and also energy transition is secondary because the PT government is very enthusiastic about oil and gas. Okay, so this is would be my third question, and my I would like to my fourth question. I would like to know better from you. Why do you think that there is, according to what I have read, there is some industrial policy in Chile in favor of solar, not wind, but solar. It's not the classical, the Brazilian type of industrial policy, but there is a state intervention in favor of solar that has been very successful. And as you said, is much more based in not the opposite of the Brazilian idea of national components. Okay. The last question is not for specifically for Katy, but just because it was raised the reason that Bolsonaro, what is the impact of the Bolsonaro removal of the Castelo Branco as president of Petrobras? The major cause is that Bolsonaro is more and more going in the direction of his statist view of the world. That was historically the view, and that was just an accommodation in 2018 with Paulo Guedes. Paulo Guedes is extremely weakened right now, and there is all the more and more Bolsonaro has the control of all the policies in Brazil. If you look at the health policy, the education policy, and the economic policy is growing, controlled by Bolsonaro. And of course, the military like this new direction of Bolsonaro. Okay, so there is we are going through a critical conjuncture in Brazil. in which there is a major change in coalitions, economic, political economy coalitions, okay? And the likely outcome of all this is less economic growth, more social crisis, increased inflation. So even it's a policy that is based in the handbook for winning elections, the situation of Brazil is so critical in terms of the public debt and the fiscal imbalance that likely will produce the opposite, will produce increase the deepening of the crisis, and probably will not be a driver of his re-election. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you to both discussants. I'm still shaking a little about the idea of the future of Brazil being Argentina's decline. But I want to give Kathy a few minutes first to respond to the discussants before we open this up for questions. Go ahead.
Thank you very much to both discussants for raising a number of probing issues. And I'm pretty sure I can't actually fully address any of them, but there are some things that I can say that I think will be clarifying to you and to the audience without hopefully getting too far down in the weeds. It's always a little bit dangerous to ask me questions about the energy system in Brazil. But I mean, there are a couple of things that I would want to say that I think will clarify that in many ways I actually agree with you, but it might be also helpful for understanding kind of the broader energy system in which the wind and solar power sit in Brazil. So I guess I'm taking Alicia's second question first, which is this question about outages and attribution. And I mean, there's an interesting history of that in Brazil, which is that as in your personal experience, the form of electricity that has been problematic for Brazilians and about which they have noticed problems is actually hydropower. And your own experience, and then this also gets to something Eduardo raised, the very beginning of when wind power in Brazil was in 2001, following another major drought and a major drying up of hydropower. And so there's no question but that the whole wind power trajectory begins in Brazil on the basis of really an energy security issue, that they're not thinking of climate in 2001, they're thinking about turning the lights back on. And what I would say is, you know, whatever the problems of outages and the like in Brazil for wind power, there's no question but that to date, they have been swamped by the problems with hydropower. And they're going to be even more swamped. And I happen to know, because I've just been asked to write a blurb for it, that Eduardo has an even more recent book that's about to come out, that's actually about the way that the Amazon is kind of fundamentally biophysically in crisis, and in a water crisis in particular. And that what we have for the foreseeable future for Brazilian hydropower is more droughts. Now, how does wind fit into that? Well, there's a really interesting way that wind fits into that, which is that wind and hydro in Brazil have counter seasons. So the seasons when there's lots of hydropower is a low wind power time, and the seasons when there's little hydropower, drought years, are like high wind time. So I think for wind power, there's a kind of interesting optic, which is that at the moment when people are blaming the reservoirs and hydropower for no electricity, the wind turbines are going fast. You know, that's their prime time. And so I actually think that the kind of criticism as unreliable in the Brazilian context so far has been much more the story of hydropower, and with the coming climate changes is going to be even more the story of hydropower and not so much the story of wind power. And in fact, I mean, in some ways, you know, the story about the unreliability of wind and solar power and that kind of thing, that's like almost a 6 or 7 year old argument. I mean, it's been not really an issue for quite some time, because for a long time, people who managed the grids were very concerned about that. But at this point, you know, certainly up to 25% of the grid can straightforwardly be wind and solar power. That's easy for grid managers to manage at this point. Brazil with wind power is still at 10%. So I think the story of sort of crisis and outages in Brazil is going to be a hydro story, not a wind story. And that is part of kind of the wider story of the politics of it, which is that hydropower, which has been Brazil's big source of electricity and much of the rest of the region, is in crisis on its own terms. So it's in crisis in terms of drying up. It's in crisis in terms of, you know, the growing amount of civil society opposition to big wind power, to big hydro plants in the Amazon in particular. That's across the region. A Peruvian mobilization against Brazilian builders of hydropower in their country. You know, that's like, hydro is in trouble. And I think largely didn't mobilize against wind power, in part because the whole grid was growing, but also because hydro has its own trouble, you know, quite apart from wind. So I think that's part of what's going on with the larger politics of that. But who do people blame? I don't think they're going to be blaming wind power as unreliable. Then fossil fuels, and why fossil fuels haven't had as much resistance. Is that going to change in the future? I actually see Petrobras and the oil industry and that whole package as, you know, occupying a semi-sacred space in Brazil. Like, I think that there's very little political possibility of that space being challenged. But I see huge changes internationally. I see big changes in terms of the willingness of finance in particular, but also importers of the oil and gas. I see a whole set of international dynamics going on that I think are going to make the Pre-Sal less and less viable economically. They already have in many ways, compared to what Brazilians originally thought back in 2007 and 2008. I think in a lot of ways, I think the fossil fuels of South America are going to die from market forces long before the political forces move against them. So that's sort of my assessment, not just of Brazil, but of the region more generally, because the market forces are really moving fast on oil and gas. Now there is a small exception, and this is something that I think is worth noting, but Brazil is now building more gas-powered power plants, and it's arguing that it needs it for, you know, some of the same kinds of reasons that you're talking about. You know, there needs to be some sort of electricity, and I think I saw a question in the Q&A. There needs to be some kind of electricity that also does work to balance the intermittency of wind and solar power. Historically, Brazil's been able to use hydro in much that way, but gas is the easiest to start up and slow down. So I think there is a role for gas there that will be hard to move away from. But yeah, and Steve put a question into the chat, is this also going to be true for Texas? Yeah, I think it's also true for Texas that the economics already has moved against. I mean, the amount of money that has been lost in the fracking industry over the last decade, and the huge drop in the value of petroleum reserves in recent years. The big oil majors are writing off those reserves right and left. The economic factors are coming in long before the political ones do. So I think that that's definitely going to help, or going to help make that change. And so in terms of the long-term outlet that Alicia asked me about, you know, I think for the next 10 years, we may still see oil and gas in the kind of position that they are, but it's a declining position. But I don't think the long-term outlook for I think the long-term outlook is moving in the direction of wind and solar power for economic reasons, quite apart from everything else that's going on. And then siting policy, I'm so glad you asked about siting policy, because that's the chapter in my book that's really hard to make part of the story, because there's actually lots of contention in Brazil around wind power. And I do research that shows about 25% of the communities that host wind power are resisting that wind power. But of course, that's the one that's growing. So they're not stopping it. And I do think that it's an interesting pattern. I encourage anyone to pick up the book and look at it for that chapter in particular because I think it's super interesting to look at how do local communities respond to the wind power. It's not aesthetics. It's not bird life. It's sort of low income socioeconomic communities, a lot of them former Quilombola communities. It's about land rights and access. There's quite interesting dynamics of that. But it's in 25% of the communities, and there are lots of places you can build wind power in Brazil where you wouldn't get, and you don't get that kind of opposition. So I think it's actually just because of the fact that you can place wind power and solar power in so many locations, I think that that's not really a binding constraint for Brazil, even though some of the projects have been really problematic. And then just moving on to Eduardo's, so if people don't know this, Eduardo and I have been in a long-standing argument about whether or not Brazil is a rising or declining power. And the framing of Brazil as a rising power is from my grant that I wrote in 2010. It's not actually what I would necessarily say in 2021. It's been a convenient framing because it was convincing to grant givers. And, for a while, I mean, Eduardo, we wrote an article together that talked about, what Brazil was doing in climate action. But yeah, I mean, I think on this, I do worry about Brazil. I see really problematic developments in the last couple of years. I'm not convinced for the topic of my book narrowly that they're going to have much impact on wind and solar power. I actually think that's just going to go on being built because it makes economic sense, and the actors are in place, and Bolsonaro, that's not where his attention is. But is Brazil a declining power? Well, I certainly wouldn't be arguing it's a rising one. So, and then I think that this is quite relevant. So I'm going to link your question about being, and I'm almost done here, Fran. I know you're trying to make room for some others here. So I'm going to link your question about being bureaucracy driven and the fact of no energy transition, because I think those are in some ways linked. Because when you are bureaucratically driven in your selection of wind and solar power, and you're doing it for cost reasons, and you're doing it because it makes sense in this bureaucracy. So it's not just BNDES. The book also talks about the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, which is part of the Ministry of Energy. It talks about the licensing process. There's a whole lot of bureaucracies. ANEEL, the regulator, get involved in this. So there's a lot of this activity. But I think one of the things that happens is a somewhat counterintuitive double fact of there's a lot of wind power being built, but it's not really being built in service of an energy transition per se. So it doesn't have the larger framing of energy transition, but it is happening. And, and that's one of the ironic things, that in part because wind power is, if anything, replacing hydro really in the grid, then it's swapping one low carbon electricity for another low carbon electricity. And you're right, the actual dominance of fossil fuels doesn't really change. But I do think that it's playing an important role in keeping oil and gas out. So I think in that sense, it's contributing to at least not moving backwards. And then I would just say there is something of an industrial policy in Chile for solar power, but it's not what people normally think about. And people don't normally think about industrial policy being about demand. But one of the arguments that I make in my chapter is that one of the most significant components of what the Brazilian and South African states do for wind and solar power is they demand more of it. They procure it. And in the procuring of it, that then sets up. So once Brazil starts to regularly procure lots of wind power year after year after year, then it makes sense for the manufacturers to move to Brazil and meet that demand. And Chile is doing something the same kind of thing. So Chile is demanding more and more solar power, and it's having a similar effect. Now, more often when we talk about industrial policy, we are looking at, the production side. But I think the demand side is really underestimated as a component of industrial policy. And I think you have that in large shape.
So I'm going to discipline myself to ask an absolute minimum number of questions and change up our marching orders just a little and invite Steve to also pose a couple of questions so we can collect them for a second round so that we can get some more questions in. The first thing I want to note is in the chat, that Georgie Camini has asked whether you can share the slide presentation. I feel like I should say buy the book, but
Sure, no problem.
this is, and you've already sort of addressed my colleague Ashley Brown's comments about the backup of wind and solar. He was asking about these, so that's great. So here's my question, Kathy. As you were talking about state capacity, it struck me you were also saying something implicitly about state autonomy. And I'm wondering if in narrowing the definition of your outcome from energy transit, from sort of energy to electricity and wind, and your admission that these generate less political conflict in Brazil than deforestation and even the future of Petrobras, biofuels, whatever, whether it becomes a story of state capacity because there's less political opposition that could, if we were thinking about this in terms of state autonomy, penetrate the state in the different ministries. If we go back to this old literature, Cardozo's old image of bureaucratic rings, the way Kurt Weiland talked about different organized interests attacking different segments of the bureaucracy, one would think about this fragmentation of energy policy as a recipe for penetration by strong, powerful societal interests. Is the reason that we're talking about capacity because wind and solar have sort of flown a little bit under the political conflict and political radar in a way that would not be true of those issues. If we have much more powerful interests lined up in opposition, would we be telling a different story about the state here? And to my one question, I'm going to tack on one other from the chat, which is from Ben Bradlow, who's one of our postdocs who actually knows something about South Africa as well as Brazil. And he wants to know about the international dimension. You started to bring this up, but he reminds us that the developmental state literature in the 80s and 90s was focused on international learning and development catch-up. And he wants to know whether this played a role in Brazil and South Africa. And now I'm going to invite Steve to toss out a couple of questions, and then we'll give this back to the panel.
Okay, just a couple more. One, building on Ben's question, I also really like the your application of comparative political economy approach here. It seemed really useful, and maybe think about the energy transition. Not that I think about the energy transition enough, but it made me think about it in ways that that I hadn't before. I think it's really fruitful. And in particular, this idea drawing from my old friend Peter Kingstrom of constructing coalitions to build to support and sustain reform. My question, again, dovetailing a little bit with Ben, is how does it get on the agenda? So in the 80s and 90s, when it came to economic liberalization, it was a product of domestic crisis and pressure from international financial agencies. In this case, you mentioned the crisis of early 2000 and actually needing the energy to turn the lights on. But broadly in Latin America, could you say a little bit more about the politics of how renewable energy gets on the agenda in the early 21st century? The other question, much more targeted, is channeling Alice Zhu, who asks, she said it was really interesting to hear about the role of state bureaucrats and state autonomy in the Brazilian case, and asks whether these are just federal bureaucrats or whether state and local bureaucrats are also making critical decisions. And if it's the latter, there's a lot of turnover, a lot of bureaucratic turnover in the heads of local secretariats. She wanted to hear something about the consequences of bureaucratic turnover for this sector.
Okay, can I just be clear on the expectation? Is this now going to take me through to the end, or are we going to have more questions after that?
It can be
It
either.
depends on how disciplined all three of you are in your answers here.
It's okay if you go to all the way to the end.
Okay. Well, let me start by telling you that I think, so Fran, your original question about state capacity, this is one of the places where the discussion is really hampered by the fact that you asked me only to talk about the Brazilian case and not also the South African case. So I will just say that if somebody wants an hour-long version, or if somebody wants a 45-minute presentation on the book for a Latin America audience, I did that for Oxford about 2 weeks ago. If somebody wants the 45-minute presentation on both Brazil and South Africa, that's really comprehensive. I did one for Manchester's GDI, Global Development Institute, maybe, I don't know, November or something like that. So there are other versions of this talk out there if you don't want to buy the book, but of course buy the book, but you can see that. And the thing is, Fran, your questions make a lot of sense. You know, is this really, if we had, you know, if we had powerful actors in the energy sector that were engaged in this, wouldn't we have penetration? I can see why you asked that question if you're only looking at the Brazilian case. And in fact, what happens is that the questions work really well also for the South African case, where you in fact do have super powerful actors who then do exactly what you expect. They reach into the bureaucracy. There's a slide that I have that I should show you, or you can find the one in the book, but it shows, so you know, you saw my nice Brazilian graphs of the steadily rising wind and solar power. Well, the equivalent of that graph in South Africa goes like, basically, because all of these actors, politicized actors, get into the planning process and disrupt it and keep it. Like literally South Africa cannot decide for 8 years how much wind and solar power it's going to produce, because it keeps coming out every year or two with these new plans. And it's like, lots of it. No, hardly any. Oh, we're going to do nuclear. No, we're going to do coal. And, you know, and it's, and so what you're expecting to see does in fact show up very much for the South African case. And so all I'm saying is, I think your intuition is right, that this depoliticized quality of the Brazilian case, the ability to look at bureaucratic capacity and bureaucratic operating procedures and things like that, is in fact a function of the fact that there's no big, powerful, galvanizing fossil fuel actor in the electricity sector in Brazil. And in fact, that's the argument of my book. So that's the argument that it's a proposal that these are two modes of transition, one of which comes when you've got that kind of actor, one of which comes when you don't. But that the depoliticized process is actually a function of the fact that you don't have that galvanizing actor. So I think we actually, our perspectives are not really different. And I'm not sort of avoiding an issue. It's just once I decided to do the Brazil-South Africa comparison, then Brazil takes on certain qualities that it doesn't have necessarily on its own. And the original version of the project was all the electricity sectors in Brazil, or all the energy sectors in Brazil. Then I ran into Peter Evans, who said, oh, no, you should do a comparison with South Africa. So then once I was going to do the comparison with South Africa, well, South Africa doesn't have hydro, and it doesn't have biofuels, and it doesn't have all these other things, but it does have wind and solar. And so once I had my comparison, then the only thing I could compare was Brazil and South Africa. And then you get, anyway, that's more history maybe than you wanted to have about that. Yeah, I mean, I think what Brazil is showing is that the state capacity question is very relevant, because the state capacity question asks, when can the state identify its interests in a sector and impose them on powerful actors? And the Brazilian case shows us that when there is none of those powerful actors directly in the sector, yeah, the state can do kind of what it wants. And South Africa shows us when you have that really powerful kind of actor in the sector, well, probably you can't. Although there's lots of other stuff going on in South Africa, corruption cases and apartheid legacies and these kinds of things. So the international dimension, interesting question. I originally thought there was going to be an international dimension in every chapter. The climate chapter does have one. I thought then when I got to industrial policy, the WTO would play a big role. Both in Brazil and South Africa, they're like, we don't care about the WTO. We're doing our industrial policy the way we want to do it. And as sort of I moved through the chapter, the international dynamics disappeared. as important in defining the outcome. But I gave a presentation on this very topic to York University earlier today, and somebody asked me the same question, and I finally actually got a good answer that I think is actually quite relevant. So there's one international, and I say at the end of the first chapter, in this case, wind and solar, Brazil and South Africa, the international really doesn't seem that relevant. But there's one really critical international factor that we figured out in the context of my earlier talk today. And I actually talk about it in chapter 1, because one of the things I say in chapter 1 is I'm trying to write about wind and solar power in middle income and developing countries. Why would I think that things would be different in middle income and developing countries? And some of it is because the countries themselves are different. But the other thing, now I'm getting back to the international thing. The other thing that's really different is that when countries like Brazil and South Africa and the rest of the developing world and the other late adopters of wind and solar power begin interacting with wind and solar power, there are massive global supply chains, huge international installation firms, lots of global finance issues. So there is now a global wind and solar industry in ways that there simply were not when Germany had like community-owned renewables. A lot of people have a false impression of wind and solar power as like some warm, fuzzy, small is beautiful kind of thing. But when middle income and developing countries go into wind and solar power, they are facing a global industry that's very powerful and very strong. And so by the time South Africa is doing its 4th round of auctions, the winners are all Enel from Italy and Spanish companies and like the South Africa. These were supposed to be jobs. These were supposed to be things that Black South African entrepreneurs could win. But instead, it's the Italians and the Spaniards, and a lot of it is because they have access to cheap finance. So the industry is a global industry in ways that permeate through every chapter. Why is siting a big issue? Well, siting is a big issue because a wind power plant now is possibly hundreds of turbines that are huge, that are being mounted by some multinational corporation that won because its bid was cheap and is coming in and doing it on the cheap. But that's why, because it's cheap, that's why Brazil and South Africa are doing it. But the cheapness and the giant industry are two sides of the same thing. So I could say a lot more, but that I think gets to that. So how do wind and solar get on the agenda? Well, Brazil and South Africa actually follow I think what's been one of the most common kinds of trajectories, which is that in both cases, it arises out of a supply crisis. So I mentioned the 2001 in Brazil. When does South Africa start to talk about wind and solar power? Why? In 2007 and 2008, when they start having load shedding every day and there's not enough electricity to supply all consumers. And then wind and solar power start to look attractive because you can build them in 18 months, or you can put up solar installations even faster. It takes 10 years to build a Belo Monte. It takes 10 years to build nuclear. So wind and solar power in almost all countries beyond the first adopters comes along as an energy security issue. And Brazil and South Africa are no exception to that. So I think that's like the standard way it gets on the agenda. Certainly for these two countries it is. And then federal bureaucracy or state and local. Most of the things that I end up talking about in the book are federal bureaucracy issues, because it's the federal bureaucracy that negotiates climate change and sets out the national climate laws. There's subnational elements to climate also, but it's mostly federal. BNDES is federal. A lot of the auctions are federal. Some of the distribution issues are more localized, but the cost setting is done federally. And the one place where you do get a lot of state and local actors is in the chapter on siting, because it is generally state environmental agencies that do the environmental licensing for those, and with predictably different results. But for the most part, I am talking about federal bureaucracies because that's where the action is on these issues. So I think that's my 4 questions.
Okay, well, and that was sensational, and that has brought us to the end of our time. I can't tell you how grateful we are. First of all, well, first to you, but I want to first mention how grateful we are to Alicia and to Eduardo for your wonderful comments today. Some provocative, some informative, but always pertinent, always great. And I think I can say that Kathy appreciated them too. And Kathy, I want to just say how much we admire what you've done here. I'm sitting here thinking about the science that you've mastered, let alone all the actors and working in these two countries, and they're big, huge countries. And it's really impressive. We hope this book does really well for you. I have really very little doubt that that will be the case. But meanwhile, I did not know you were doing 2 talks in the same day. So this is super heroic. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're just delighted to have had you here, and congratulations on this book. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. And I'm just trying to put a, there we go. I just put the 20% discount code in the chat, in the Q&A. So that's there. Should anybody want 20% off the book, you can find it. I think I put it in the answer to, where did I put it? Well, I'll send that. When I send the slides, I'll send that.
Okay, well, or drop it into the chat. People do, oh, okay, there it is. Gabby just put it in the chat. The Dr.
Okay.
Class staff, once again, comes to the rescue. Okay, thanks again to everyone. And next Tuesday, we have another spectacular panel for you. Our topic is the return of the military. So please join us next week, and have a wonderful rest of the week, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
Kathy.